The Safety and Justice Committee of the whole. Today's discussion will be regarding non-public safety traffic stop changes in Ramsey County. And before we begin, kudos to our county attorney and his department, along with St. Paul, Roseville, there were other Maplewood, various other departments. I'm sure left some out, but it's great work. It's data-driven, and we're here to hear more about it and what the next steps are. So take it away, John.
I think, Scott, you wanted to...
Oh, it's Scott.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chair, thank you. Scott Williams, Deputy County Manager for Safety and Justice Service Team. We're thrilled to be here today to talk about non-public safety traffic stops. In the context of a Safety and Justice Committee of the whole, this does involve two of our departments for safety and justice, County Attorney's Office and the Emergency Communications Center. For me, this started 2.5 years ago, perhaps. Time just flies. When County Attorney Choi approached me about this issue and wanting to do something here, and but it would have to involve the Emergency Communications Center because it involved traffic stops. And what turned this into an idea for a policy change and turned it into more than that, it turned it into a study, was the underlying data needs. We talked about, well, if we only had data, and I said, the data is not the issue, the data is already there. For I would say at least 20 years, if not more, the city of St. Paul had been collecting traffic stop data around the racial, the race of the driver, the reason for the stop, and the outcome of the stop. And then I would say about, 10 years ago, or 8 or 10 years ago, that expanded through the work that the Emergency Communications Center did with all of our partner law enforcement agencies. That practice expanded countywide. And all of our law enforcement agencies were approached and said, hey, we're doing this for St. Paul. We'd like to work consistently as much as we can across the board with all of our communities. Would all of the rest of our law enforcement agencies be interested in doing this? We thought the answer would be, well, would be lukewarm, or no, we're not really interested. No, every one of them said, yeah, this is a good idea. Let's do it across the board. And that kind of set the stage for what we're going to talk about today to become a research project and provided the data, the before data, if you will, which is usually hard to come by when you want to do these kinds of initiatives and these kind of research projects. The before data was already there, and the data collection mechanism was already in place. And so that set the foundation for this idea for this initiative to come along and result in the outcome we have today, that we're going to report on today. I have to say I'm so proud of my team, and I'm so proud of County Attorney Choi and the courage that he showed in taking this stand and standing up this initiative and leading this work, and which resulted in what we're going to the results that we're seeing today. This was a very risky decision on his part, and like I say, it was very courageous, and I'm very proud of the results that we're going to share today.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the board. Really pleased to be here today, and I'm really thankful for the opportunity to go maybe into a little bit more detail to talk about some of the behind-the-scenes work to pull all this together. But I would even go back further than what Scott Williams said, to maybe back to around 2007, when the commissioners here had a vision to bring the ECC together and to have a lot of that data come into the Emergency Communications Center, because of the fact that the county actually kind of owns and operates the ECC. The data that comes in has made it really, I think, easier not only to do this research, but also to have transparency and accountability. And so we knew full well with regard to the traffic stop data, and after getting all of the law enforcement agencies to record race data on the traffic stops and also on the searches, we knew back in 2021 that we had some massive disparity on motorists that were being subjected to these non-public safety traffic stops, which are solely based on mostly the equipment types of violations. So just by example, we're talking about license tabs, we're talking expired tabs, we're talking about one headlight out, something dangling from your rear view mirror. Oftentimes the way that, and I'll be the first to tell you, I was a prosecutor that was raised to believe that those types of equipment violations, if you were to enforce them and pull somebody over and then do a subsequent search, that could recover contraband, like it could recover drugs and guns. But as I have evolved and learned more about the research that's out there, the truth is, and our research actually even confirms it, that those types of traffic stops for the purpose of doing some sort of proactive policing simply doesn't work. The hit rate in Ramsey County was 1%. Back in 2021, I was saying that the research suggested it was somewhere between 2 to 5%. So in Ramsey County, it was even lower. So we know that that type of policing doesn't work. We also know that there's better ways to do that policing focused on actually solving crimes and going after violent crime, et cetera. So with all of that knowledge, and as Scott said, it was a really hard conversation because, like I told you, I was raised to believe that this works, right? And so this notion of getting people to change was not an easy thing. But I want to just say that in order to make this happen, it just took a lot of conversations, and it really had to be one that was, I think, coming from law enforcement. I think there's always this notion that we can have all the policies in the world, but at the end of the day, nothing will change unless you can address some of the culture. And that culture isn't going to change in my office or in other parts of law enforcement unless the leadership is really committed to it. So it took a while to get people kind of on board onto this change. In fact, for me, I was confronted with this idea, and I remember I was really confronted with it because we were at a convening of prosecutors, and people were asking about how prosecutors around the country could use their power and their role to influence some of the things that need to change to increase the level of constitutional protection for our residents. And one of the ideas that was generated from this convening was the prosecutor utilizing their power of the front door about what kind of cases could come into their office to make a stand on this particular issue. I remember when they went around the room, I said something along the lines of maybe, I don't know, I have to talk to my folks about that. And so I went back, and this was probably back in 2019 before the pandemic, and the first round of conversations was an absolute no way. There's no way we can do this because we think that this actually leads to public safety. And then what happened, though, in our community, and we've had some traumatic things happen with traffic stops. In fact, my orientation and place of where I start from is just I will always be a part of what will be a part of me is the death of Philando Castile. And he was pulled over on an equipment violation. At the end of the day, that was the justification given by the police officer. And we've also had tragedy after tragedy in our community. George Floyd and, of course, Dante Wright. And so those things that happened in our community, those really sad, terrible things, I think it opened the door a little bit more for some more conversation with our police leadership. And I just want to credit them because they, I think, did much of the hard work because once they came to a place that they would be willing to make the change to do this in tandem with my policy. And I said out loud to them that I would for sure do this. I would do this alone if I had to. But we got to a place where we had St. Paul, Roseville, and Maplewood. In fact, Roseville doesn't get enough credit because Erica Scheider, the chief, who, by the way, was wanting to be here today, but I think some good news for her daughter. Her daughter's a soccer player, and their team kept winning, and so she's still down in St. Louis. But she was the first chief, and we should be really proud of our Roseville police chief. She was the first chief that actually enacted a change on August 1st of 2021, and they actually did a policy and connected that to the city council's racial equity goals. And then, of course, on September 8th, we publicly announced our policy along with the city of St. Paul's directive by then Chief Todd Axtell. And then subsequent to that, the city of Maplewood also made the changes to de-emphasize these lower level equipment violations and really prioritize the moving violations. And of course, in our county, because there are some police agencies that went along with that change and actually took steps to say, this is what we're doing, we also had some police agencies that didn't. And for I think every police chief should be doing what their community wants them to do. And so some agencies made that determination and that decision. And so we had a way that we could actually do some research, because we knew we had some agencies that didn't make any changes and we had some that did. And I just want to remind you that the disparities at that time for searches was 9-1. So for every search that was conducted, 9 motorists who were black were being subject to those searches, and we also had a 4-1 disparity on these stops as well. And we also wanted to look at whether or not this had any impact on public safety. And so we engaged the Justice Innovation Lab, and this is all part of the generosity of our philanthropy community here in the state of Minnesota. Minnesota and St. Paul Foundation stepped up to fund that research, to fund the alternatives that we have going right now, and have helped people who have issues with financially with getting good on the tabs. They've funded that, but they've also funded this research. And Mark is here. He's going to go through some of these slides real quick, and then we're also going to, and I'm just really proud of the fact, and I mentioned this in my press conference, but Nancy Pass and her leadership, Scott said it was really easy because we had all this data together, but still someone had to say that we're going to make this work, and we're going to figure out an easy 20-second step-by-step tool for the police so that they could utilize the alternative. And we'll talk a little bit more about the alternative. So, Mark, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, Commissioners. I'm Mark Haase, Assistant County Attorney. Can we go back to the PowerPoint slide on the screen? Great. Thank you. First of all, here's our agenda for this presentation. We'll talk about establishing these changes, which John has talked about some. The research and the results, the alternatives, and then we'll talk about possible next steps and time for a discussion, hopefully. So John talked about some of the rationale and goals of this work. One is, of course, reducing racial disparities. Prior to the policy being announced, the Star Tribune did a report on the racial disparities, which the research has subsequently shown to be correct for the whole county. Their story was on St. Paul, but that is that black residents were 4 times more likely to be pulled over for an equipment stop than white residents, and 9 times more likely to be searched as a result of those stops. These stops can also put residents and officers at unnecessary risk. And resources, which we have limited law enforcement resources, can be shifted to more public safety needs. These are the jurisdictions that changed their policies or practices. As John noted, Roseville they created a policy. John made a policy about charging decisions, which we'll cover. And then the other 3 departments listed here made their changes by directive. Their chiefs told their officers, basically, we're going to change this, and they worked on how to change it. This is the Roseville policy that was, as John stated, was enacted on August 1st of 2021. And that, you can see in the note there, began as a directive back in 2017. So Roseville had been doing racial equity work for a while, and this came as a result of that work. John announced our policy on September 8th of 2021. One thing that we want to point out is that there is an exception to the policy for a public safety danger or a dangerous condition. And later on in the presentation, we're going to give you information about what's happened with cases that have come to our office. This is our policy again. These are the types of equipment infractions for which we would not charge an underlying or a resulting discovery of an offense unless there is that public safety exception. One I want to point out here is later on we'll look at the drop down that officers can see in their squad You won't see muffler excess noise violations there. St. Paul and Roseville decided they wanted to continue stopping for those because of just the nuisance that can create, and they want to be able to address that right away. So these next slides are slides that the Justice Innovation Lab at George Washington University put together based on their research. Again, this was funded by funding developed at the Minnesota and St. Paul Foundation. As I already noted, the researchers were able to work with the ECC to get data. They also worked with the City of St. Paul. Of course, we developed the required data sharing agreements for that. So, getting into the research results. This first slide is overall stops and seizures. So this is all traffic stops starting in 2017, going into 2022. And one reason for this slide is just to show you the overall context that this occurred in. Of course, there were major changes happening throughout our world at that time. And so you can see after the pandemic, stops throughout the county went down from 2019 to 2020. And also I'll note, we've got this broken down by St. Paul, other aligned police departments, which are the other departments that adopted policies or practices, and then the unchanged policy police departments. We'll continue with these colors. They broke out St. Paul because it's such a large percentage of the stops, of course. And then you can see, later on we'll be looking at the change. Yes.
Go ahead, May. I have a question.
Yes, I just have a question about the unchanged policy for the police departments. Does that include all of the other Ramsey County police departments?
Yes, Commissioner, that would be all other departments in Ramsey County, the ones that didn't change their policy or practices. So, yeah.
Okay, yeah. All right, and that includes our sheriff's office?
It does include the sheriff's office.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, excuse me, Victoria?
Okay. So who's not included? Are there certain which communities decided to not participate?
I'm going to let County Attorney Choi take that.
Yeah, so the police agencies, there was 9 police agencies operating in Ramsey County, and so the ones that were not directly involved in actually doing something affirmative on this in tandem with our policy would be Mounds View, White Bear Lake, the sheriff's patrol area, Little Canada, and there's one more.
New Brighton?
St. Paul or North St. Paul?
Or North St. Paul. North St. Paul.
Oh, and I wasn't trying to call them out for any particular reason other than just knowing which areas were covered, so that you've got Maplewood is the largest suburb, and Roseville is, I think, second.
Yes.
In Ramsey County, so it's a good mix, even though I guess, honestly, I made the assumption that the sheriff's office was included in this, so that's really too bad that didn't happen in coordination with this really good work. But anyhow, I was just trying to figure out the amount that was covered, and it's really, even though there are that many other departments and the sheriff's office does some contract cities, it's a very good sampling, I guess.
Yeah, in fact, I would say that just having St. Paul, Roseville, Maplewood, that represents, in terms of at least cases coming to my office, almost probably about 70%.
Yes.
So it's a big chunk of our county. And then also, too, later in the presentation, I have some good news about the sheriff's office as well.
All right, I look forward to that.
Okay.
All right, thank you. And you can see the raw numbers for these stops in this slide here if you're interested in the raw numbers. So now we're going to get into the changes that occurred. So this slide is just for vehicle equipment violation stops before and after the policy change, so roughly 2021 to 2022. And you can see the dark blue is St. Paul, the light blue is the other aligned police departments, and the yellow-orange is the non-aligned departments. And this slide shows the change from the prior years. So, for example, St. Paul stops went down for equipment violations over 90%. In other aligned departments, they went down over 50%. So that's, what we said we were going to do happened is basically what that says. Now, this next slide is looking at the percentage of traffic stop types before and after change implementation. So this is getting to that goal of how are we allocating police resources. And you can see the top three grids are before the change and the lower are after. And this is just for St. Paul right now. You can see that moving violations went from 68% of all stops to 88% of all stops after the change. And vehicle violations dropped from 25% to 4%. So in other words, those police resources are being more directed towards those public safety traffic stops.
And per the mayor and the chief of police when they talked about these slides, they're currently this year they're trending. They've got many more traffic violations, and the percentage of moving violations is over 90%. So which means that the non-moving or the equipment violations are even less.
I think you said 93%?
Yeah, 93%.
Going on to the next slide, this is for all the other aligned police departments. They saw a similar shift going from vehicle violation stops being 22% of their stops before the changes and 9% after the changes. And then for all the other departments, you can see there was a little bit of a change, but not much, and not nearly as much as the others where the change occurred. Vehicle violation stops went from 25% to 23.7% of stops. And then next, looking at racial disparities. This is again showing before the change on the top and after the change on the bottom. So here you can see that 4-to-1 disparity for the moving violations. For the vehicle equipment violations mentioned before. 55 out of 1,000 people for black residents, and I think it's 12% for white residents. And then after the change, it went to, boy, this is really small print, sorry. 18.5% for black residents to 6.9% for white residents. So still, it's about a 2-to-1 disparity, but the disparity has been cut in half. And then for the searches, it's gone down even more. For searches from vehicle equipment violations, we're at 5 before the change, 5.7 in 1,000 for black residents, and 0.6 for white, and now it's 0.8 and 0.2 respectively. So more than a halving there.
Excuse me. Nina?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm sorry, can you explain the moving violations to me?
Excuse me, Commissioner, I didn't hear that.
Can you explain the moving violations? I mean, that's people driving, speeding, or something of that sort?
Sure, Commissioner, that could be driving while impaired, it could be reckless driving, it could be speeding, it could be something more, I guess, innocuous, like a turn signal, failure to use a turn signal or something like that. It's basically anything that would be a vehicle violation almost, besides the ones that, we've listed that are just simply equipment violations.
Okay, thank you.
Going on to the next slide and the next topic here, John had mentioned that we wanted to look at the impact on crime. So the researchers looked at 911 calls to try to get a measure of this. And first they looked at all 911 calls from the public. And you can see towards the right here of this graph, there's a line titled Changes Implemented. That's when the policy and changes were implemented. And you can see 911 calls came down a little bit there. And you've got St. Paul on the top. The yellow is the unchanged policy police departments, and the light blue are the changed policy and practices ones. What the researchers concluded from this is that there was no discernible effect. You can see going back on the graph that every year in the fall, crime goes down, and in the next summer it comes up. That's just an annual cycle that's pretty well known. Now, oops, we just lost visual. So they broke out 911 calls for violent and nonviolent crime. I'm going to focus on the violent offenses, or reported crimes, I should say. For St. Paul, there was a 1.5% increase after the policy and changes were implemented. For other aligned departments, there was a 3.7% increase. And for the departments that did not change their policies or practices, you can see their violent crime calls went up 7.4%. So if that's sort of a control group, you can infer from that this did not have an impact. There were some violent crime increases from 21 to 22 that we know of outside of this policy change and happening, nationally. So again, the researchers concluded that there was no discernible impact on crime. The final measure they looked at to see if they could see any impact was firearm seizures in St. Paul. St. Paul has been recording firearm seizures for traffic stops, as you can see in the graph here, starting in January of 2021. An important thing to note here is that they do not break their data on this out by equipment traffic stops. So this is for all traffic stops. So you can see when the policy was implemented, firearm seizures did go down slightly. You can also, if you look on the left-hand side, this is, and in the key, so to speak, this is the average daily firearm seizure by month. So these are pretty low raw numbers, but it looks like they did go down a little bit. But if you look back at the first slide where St. Paul had a pretty large decrease in all traffic stops from 21 to 22. They had, here in St. Paul, we had other things going on, some significant violent crime, resource issues with the police department. They moved away from traffic stops for a while to focus on other things. So that could easily explain the drop there as well. And so what the researchers concluded is there's no significant difference. In fact, when they look at the average the year before and the year after, it stayed the same, an average of about 1.4 per day.
Excuse me.
I just wanted to clarify on the chart what the side numbers of 0 to 2.5, so it was
Per
like
day.
one firearm per day.
Per
Is that
day,
what that?
The average for the month.
Okay.
And I think that's one of the most important points is that the researchers talk about that these numbers are low to begin with. So these are all firearm. The top line represents all firearm seizures. The city of St. Paul averaged 1.4 guns per day before the policy, and then after the policy, they still remain at 1.4 guns per day.
Go ahead, Mark.
This next slide is changing gears a little bit. That was the end of the research slides. Now this is, as I mentioned earlier, the cases received by our office. And you can see which jurisdiction referred them, the date they were screened, the type of equipment violation, the referral charge, and the outcome, and whether or not they were later charged as a misdemeanor or gross misdemeanor. So if you look at the outcome, you can see that we did prosecute a total of 3 cases. We had 12 cases under this policy that came to our office. The remaining 9 we refused. Some of those were charged as misdemeanors or gross misdemeanors by the city attorneys. I'm just going to stop on that and see if we have any questions. If you want to. Okay.
Any questions?
Okay.
You did a great job.
All right. We're going to switch to the alternatives, because the other thing that John stated when he decided to do this is we don't want to just leave people hanging with taillights, headlights out, not knowing about it, vehicle registrations not paid. So we've been working for the last year and a half to get these alternatives set up, and I think we have pretty good news on this end too. This is just a diagram of how this is working, and after this I'll turn it over to Nancy Pass with the ECC. But what we decided needed to be done for this, or what the process that was created was, first of all, we needed the officers to be able to quickly enter information into their squad. Chief Scheider said that if this takes more than 20 seconds or 30 seconds, officers probably just won't do it. They'll just go on to something else. And initially there was some software work done, and St. Paul was doing this, but it took quite a bit of time for the officers. So working with the ECC's folks, we were able to make it to a drop-down menu that Nancy will talk about. That information then goes back to the ECC, and the ECC created a system where that will go into a separate data collection, an Excel spreadsheet, or it could even go automatically into a letter if the agency wanted to. But then that information goes back to the department, the police department. Currently, Roseville and St. Paul are doing this, and they just do a mail merge into a letter that's then sent to the owner of the vehicle saying, your vehicle was observed on such and such date, but with the following equipment violation or violations, please get it fixed. You won't hear more about this. This is not a citation or something to that effect. And if you need assistance with getting a repair or with getting your license tabs renewed, here are a couple of resources. And so we partnered with Lights On, which is a nonprofit. It's an arm of the micro grants, which is based in St. Paul. Lights On was started by Don Samuels over there, and that's a coupon system. So they have shops in the area who the person, when they get the coupon, can take it and get the repair done. And so St. Paul lets people know by letter that they can call and get one of those coupons sent to them, and then Roseville has them come into the police station and pick up one of those. And then also for the expired tabs, we partnered with Diversion Solutions, who John has worked with in the past on driver's license diversion programming, and they can walk people through the process, and if they qualify financially, they can get assistance for that. That's means tested. Lights On is not means tested, and the St. Paul, Minnesota Foundation is supporting that effort as well. I'm going to pass it over to Nancy to talk a little bit about the specifics.
Excuse me a minute. Look, I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but it always amazed me. I remember having these conversations over a decade ago. Why haven't we done that earlier? You could look at it, you could do this, you don't have to stop anybody. You could give them a fine through the mail. And it seemed to me that in the interest of police officers, instead of stopping somebody on the highway to give them a ticket for a broken tailgate and taking the risk of getting hit, that they would have done that years ago. It amazes me that it took so much negotiating with police departments to get this going when there was a lot of self-interest for a lot of reasons.
And I think the response to that is, I think there was a strong belief that still resides in many of, I think, the minds of police leaders around this country, that doing these particular stops can lead to the seizure of contraband. And the truth is that, once in a while they'll hit the jackpot and they'll find a gun or something. But the truth is it doesn't happen that often. In fact, it's like we said in our study, it was 1%. And so where in America would we ever allow for a practice that is only 1% successful to continue? In fact, if you were a basketball player, you'd be on the bench, or the coach would probably suggest you should play another sport.
Ryan, thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I wanted to add to this, and the county attorney and I had a chance to talk about some of this data before, and one of my takeaways is one of the best ways to promote public safety broadly is to think about limiting interactions that do not hold significant value but bring significant risk to all parties that can be involved. And approaching a vehicle has been routinely cited in many different places as one of, particularly at night, you can't see into the vehicle, you don't know who might be there. That's a dangerous moment for a law enforcement officer, and it can be for the individual in the vehicle. And so your point is really well taken. And I think back to even this morning, the update I gave about people coming to work every day in our organization and around our organization trying to do good work who sometimes get hurt. And sometimes, unfortunately, as the county attorney mentioned, worse than just even getting hurt, loss of life can occur. It's imperative that we continue to share this data and talk about focusing risk in areas with the greatest return, and realizing that when ineffectual, it can have life-altering circumstances. And so I appreciate you raising that. I just wanted to add that to it.
And Mr. Chair, I think one more thing I think you're on to something that's so critically important. I mean, who woke up one day and said the police are in charge of enforcing the tabs and all of that? We're actually making our police officers into bill collectors, into tax collectors, and putting them at odds with our community. In fact, the work to collect the tabs and things like that really belongs with the DMV. They know exactly who hasn't paid. They can remind people to pay, and they can commence whatever ways to get the tabs paid. I think we put too many things on police officers to enforce, and it's just something that your question is something that all of our community in America should be reflecting on.
Thank you. Go ahead, Mark.
All right, I'm going to hand off to Nancy here for a minute for these next couple slides. If we can get the slides back up. Well, you have it in your packet also. I'm going to go back here.
Very good. Good morning, Mr. Chair, Commissioners, County Manager O'Connor. I just have a few slides to help give perspective on how the officers utilize the technology that's in their squad car and how the statistical data used in this report is collected. So most squad cars, as you know, are equipped with a computer laptop, and that computer is connected directly to our CAD system or computer-aided dispatch system. So everything that's typed in the call for service for the public by the public safety telecommunicator is exactly what the officer sees. It just looks different from our screen to their screen. The public safety dispatcher would have had to manually record this data in the past. So when the officer would clear, they would give us a code and we would have to type in the code. So prior to having this form, we had some data that I wouldn't say necessarily was the best up-to-date data. This new system, as you can see, it's collected directly by the officer, and it's intuitive for them, and it's collected countywide. So officers are not able to bypass this data collection section unless if they were the backup unit on a traffic stop, which we believe is creating a very good data set. So an officer conducts a traffic stop. They use the radio to inform the dispatcher their location and the plate of the vehicle. The dispatcher inputs the information into the CAD system. So when the officer is preparing to clear the traffic stop, they have to close out the call with a disposition code. So that could be that they select that they wrote a citation or that they issued a warning, or even if they wanted to send a lights on voucher to the person. So when they input the traffic stop data, which is the data used for this report, which is race, gender, person search, if the vehicle was searched, and the reason for the stop, if it was a moving violation, a vehicle violation, an investigative stop, or if they stopped the vehicle because someone called in a driving complaint. They then hit submit, and they choose, if they chose the lights on voucher issued, the information is transferred from the CAD system to the department's records management system, which is then processed by the administrative assistant. Next slide. So a new tool that we have in partnership with the county attorney's office, there was a desire to develop another form that became an alternate to an officer generating a traffic stop, but that it was still self-initiated by an officer. So when an officer observes a cracked windshield or something hanging from a person's rearview mirror, an officer can run the plate, and within the return, they have an EQP button that they are able to initiate, which then brings up this form. The problem nature is automatically filled in, and the license plate is automatically filled in from the prior screen. And so the officer clicks what equipment violation they observed and then hits the submit button, which again takes about 20 seconds for the officer to then move on about their day and continue responding to other calls instead of initiating that traffic stop. The information is again transferred from that CAD system to the department's records management system, which is then processed by their administrative staff. Next slide. And so this is what the letter looks like. The letter is sent to the registered owner of the vehicle. It identifies that an officer observed a violation, that it did not result in a traffic stop, and it also identifies the date, which officer observed it, the license plate, and what area the violation occurred. This new form is available countywide and is up to each department to identify if they use it or not. Currently, I believe Roseville and St. Paul departments are the only using this form, but it is, again, available countywide. So the next slide speaks to the results of where Roseville and St. Paul Police are using this form, and I'll hand it back to Attorney Hussey.
All right, thanks, Nancy. So as you can see, these are the results so far on numbers. Since January of this year, Roseville has sent out over 1,500 letters now and 50 lights on coupons. St. Paul has been doing this a little bit longer, but they did have that reduction in traffic enforcement I mentioned. So they've had over 400 letters go out and 14 lights on coupons. And as of last time I checked a couple weeks ago, Diversion Solutions had assisted 2 people with the renewing license registration. I know that many letters with license registration issues have gone out, so we're trying to figure out why people might not be availing themselves of that option. I want to also note that we gave you a handout at the beginning of the workshop that's got some of the statements of not only our law enforcement leaders in the county, but also some community members. And then on the back page is an excerpt from a Pioneer Press article that talks about an individual and his experience receiving the letter. And, if Chief Scheider was here, I've heard her say many times that the response from the public on this has been overwhelmingly positive, and they've heard the same thing in St. Paul, that people are just really happy that they're getting noticed, they're not being stopped, they have an opportunity to take care of it and move on. And I don't know, John, do you want to speak to well, we're going to go to next steps. So just a few key takeaways from this. Racial disparities have been improved, and we can probably infer from that at least eventually community trust will improve. Just the community knowing about this work that's been done, I think, improves trust. We have more effective use of law enforcement resources. We've developed the alternatives and supports for people. Overall, public safety and justice, I think it's safe to assume, have improved. And this has been done on an evidence-based basis, which adds to accountability and transparency in government. And then I think I've mentioned all of our partners. And I'll hand it over to John for questions and discussion, and maybe John might want to talk a little bit about next steps. I know we've got some work going on in the alternatives.
Yeah, I'll just briefly just touch on just some of I think some good news coming out of all of this is that we've had subsequent conversations with all of the chiefs in our county, and I haven't had a conversation with every one of them, but I think that we're going to get to a place where all 9 police chiefs will, at least at the very minimum, take advantage of this alternative, train their officers to use it. So at the very minimum, I think you're going to have use of this alternative, which I also think will actually positively impact the racial disparity numbers, also the reliance and the shifting of focusing more on traffic. So at the very minimum, I think the rest of the county is going to for sure adopt the alternative, and we have found funding for the city of Maplewood. Maplewood will be getting some resources from the St. Paul, Minnesota Foundation to hire some clerk assistants. And then with that resource, the city of Maplewood has agreed to not only process their own program that they're going to launch in Maplewood, but also get the letters out for the rest of the county. So I think Roseville might be able to take advantage of this. North St. Paul for sure has indicated that they will do it. And this will be offered to the other agencies as well, and I think that they'll want to do that. So I think within that community of leadership in our Ramsey County community, I think people, after seeing this research, reflecting on it, have now recognized that this alternative is a good thing, and they're going to start using that. Now, I do think that it's always better to have like some sort of policy or directive or guidance that's coming from the leadership. I'm not sure exactly how that's going to work or what they're going to do, but at the end of the day, I think if you get the right type of training and the directive, I think things can even change for the better. I think another part of this too, in terms of just some next steps, is that we're going to keep looking at the data. I mean, the good news is that Ramsey County has set up an infrastructure that it's kind of easy to get the data. And so we'll continue to, figure out ways to get that out to the public so people know how we're doing on that shift from moving to more traffic enforcement that involves moving vehicles and reckless driving careless versus the equipment violations. And we're going to continue to look at the disparity information across Ramsey County because I think that our community deserves to know.
So, John, is finances the main barrier for the smaller cities to participate? Because
No.
foundation money is not, ongoing.
Yeah.
I guess you get it for 2 or 3 years.
I think police chiefs should do kind of what their community wants them to do. And so, like in White Bear Lake, as an example, I actually went to the city council and gave a presentation before the research came back. And it was a hard conversation. I mean, in fact, there was probably about 20 minutes of going back and forth, public meeting between myself and, 2 council members. But I concluded when I walked out of that building that that's their value. That's kind of what they want for the community. Now, things I think can change with more conversation. I showed up to that city council meeting and I told them, I'm not here to try to convince you. I'm not trying to win this argument. I just want to tell you what I fundamentally believe. I've been elected to be in charge of the prosecution function, and so I have the ability to say what comes in my front door. I'm not telling you about what you have to do or what your police officers should do. That's really up to you and the chief. And so we're still talking, and I think that's the most important thing. So hopefully this research and all of that will maybe, at least I think they'll take advantage of the alternative, which I think is a good first step.
Victoria?
Well, and I do think that now that the data is out there going to those communities like White Bear Lake, and hopefully, the fact is there's so much fear running rampant in our communities these days. This is something that actually calms that. Mm-hmm. I mean, when you think about, even when we were talking about mental health earlier, I thought, I remember there was a time when, I can't remember what community it was, but they decided that they were going to give out good job tickets to people, hey, you did that really well, or whatever. It was like, no. When I see, if I see lights flashing, I'm not in a good spot then because I don't know what I did or, something like that. So I thought, no, don't turn on your lights to tell somebody they did a good job. But I think even in this, when I read the story from, I think it was Richard Johnson, who had gotten this in the mail, and what he was saying, I thought, that is what I think everybody feels. I didn't have to stop because I'm going someplace, I'm doing something, but I wanted to know, and I was able to get it fixed. I mean, this just makes sense, but the perception that is out there, that all these bad people are being caught because they had a broken tail light and you caught them, that 1%, I mean, that has to stand out to people. And I'd rather have you keeping me safe and keeping my family safe than worrying about still taking care of it.
Right.
But it's not worth a police stop. It's not worth the danger that is involved in all of that. I mean, even with other traffic. You pull somebody over, that means it affects other traffic as well. So I hope that getting that out there. As far as the contract cities, I hope that this information is that there's an offer to go to all the communities, those that are participating, those that are not. But the contract cities, they're contracting for services. If they say that that's what they want in their community, I believe that that can be written into their contract so that it can be done, period. And as far as other, people think that the sheriff has patrol responsibilities across, policing responsibilities across the county. Well, that's not true. It's in those contract cities. Even if they do it elsewhere, those people are getting a free service, I guess. But the contract cities decide on that patrolling and that policing. And so I hope that we do take advantage of getting this information out to them and saying, you have the authority to say, this is what you want in your community. Your community members will be happier and safer.
And I've had a direct conversation with Sheriff Fletcher about the alternative, and so they're very much on board on getting their patrol officers utilizing the alternative.
That is really good news.
That is really good.
Thank you.
So thank you, Mr. Chair. Just thank you so much, County Attorney Choi, for your leadership in this and for being courageous, in bringing this forward. Certainly the data does show, and I can imagine communities were skeptical. And just thank you for leading on this. We really appreciate that. I'm going to give kudos to my own police chief, Erica Scheider in Roseville. She's a star, and she's doing really good work, and I'm glad to hear it's in this area as well. I'll share that with her as well when I see her next. She's everywhere in the community. I'm glad to hear that the sheriff is going to be implementing this. So even if a city, whatever a city thinks they might want, and I hope they would want this, then if they contract with the sheriff will just be able to implement this, that it won't be a city-by-city kind of thing, I'm hoping.
Well, I should just clarify, what he's agreed to do and do it enthusiastically is to utilize the alternative that the ECC has built out. So in other words, to tell the officers that they certainly can use, the drop-down menu, and instead of having to pull somebody over for an observed equipment violation, as an example, they can use the drop-down menu, and then the information, right now, the way that the latest conversation is that all that information is going to go to the city of Maplewood. And then the city of Maplewood would get the letters out for all of the various police agencies who want to participate. So for Sheriff Fletcher, it'll have his letterhead and his signature at the bottom, offering just very much the same thing that you just saw there.
That's great. And Mr. Chair, did you have on that? Okay. That is good news. So I have one of the contract cities, Little Canada. I'll be speaking to them, and I'm guessing that they probably would want to reinforce that's what they would like to have done. And just to clarify for me, if they don't do that, if the law enforcement doesn't do this, if it comes to your office, you're not going to prosecute them anyway. So if they don't use the alternative method, if they still decide to pull people over on equipment
Right,
violations.
I think that's the power of all of
That's the power
this.
of
We're
you,
all
right.
working together on this, and in tandem, it really says, it provides really a disincentive to even engage in this
Totally,
type of
right.
policing, because if you found contraband, we may not prosecute it. I mean,
Yeah.
the default is that we don't, unless there's some articulable public safety reason why we should. And we've, in the examples that we had for the past period of time, it was 3 cases that we felt we needed to prosecute.
I really appreciate. One more question, Mr. Chair, if I could. I'm assuming the fines are the same, and arguably police departments could maybe save money if they're not stopping people for these equipment violations. Hopefully this will be sustainable, so when the grant money goes away, people will be able to do this on their own. That's hopefully the goal here, right? And because I have one other question, with these equipment violations, are we finding that the fines are being paid and that the equipment's being fixed? I mean, I guess that's hard to, are we keeping track of all that? Or I don't know if this is working. And I know sometimes you don't have the good addresses, and sometimes people don't get the stuff and all of that.
Well, I guess, the take-up rate, for instance, in Roseville, it was about 1,500 letters, and it was a small, 15 people, came in for the Lights On coupon. I also think a lot of people just take care of it. I mean,
Sure.
if they
Well,
get
I
it,
hope so.
if they have the
Yeah.
resources, the means to do
Totally
it,
right.
they are appreciative. And in fact, Erica Scheider, the chief there, has gotten probably more than 15 thank you letters, believe me, because she saves them.
So cute.
So,
I love it.
but I think some of the questions that you're raising, Commissioner McGuire, about just some of the data about the take-up rate, those are things that we can work on with Lights On to understand some of the demographics of who the individuals are and how they're being utilized. I think those are future work that needs to happen. I intend to continue to raise money to fund the Ramsey County Public Safety Fund that is housed at the St. Paul, Minnesota Foundation, because we will need to fund more of the alternative for a while. But at some point, we'll need to have a conversation. I'm not sure that it's really here. I think it really belongs with the state of Minnesota about how we might fund some of these initiatives so that we can help people in low-income areas, because I think this board has done incredible work when it comes to reducing fines and fees. There's a lot more work that needs to happen at the state level and in our court system to better recognize the impact, the negative impact that fines and fees have on under-resourced communities, and how difficult it is to make yourself good in the system once your license has been suspended, your tabs have not been paid for a period of time. So I do think that we need to, maybe this is something we can work on together to build a legislative platform to do kind of what Ramsey County has done in the past, of really taking a look at that, but getting the state and the courts to do the same thing, so that we can make it easier for people to get good, because it's so hard to get good in the system. And I think there's a lot of room for improvement in our DMV, et cetera. I've had some preliminary conversations with Commissioner Jacobson and the General Counsel from the Governor's Office about this topic, about how some of these changes could really make a big difference for our community members.
John, let me ask a follow-up question. Both Victoria and Mary Jo alluded to it. So if a contract, and I'm just happen to be picking on Little Canada, which is a small city, if are those contracts individual contracts with the cities, or is it a blanket contract that they got to feed into? Because I'm saying, so White Bear might say, here are my community values, as you stated, but Little Canada says, my community values are different. Now I want to write my contract differently. So how would the sheriff deal with that?
I think the county manager might be a better person to answer it, because we don't have our civil division director here, and she would know more of the details of those contracts.
Thanks. Mr. Chair, I think this gets to the point of why, in the same way that we work to have department leaders helping set the ecosystem we're looking for, I don't think we should try to have the conversation individually through each contract. They are individual contracts with each city. And I think there is a part here where painting a vision that your end users who are contracting with you see as valuable to their community makes it easy for them to say yes. And so I do hope that instead of having to try and go to each individual city council and then amalgamate that into an ask that's collective, that we continue the conversation with the sheriff's office, that they say, we see this as a way to prioritize the right types of public safety resources toward the most significant issues in our community. And in doing that, this is a policy, because it does become an operational piece too, where there's a challenge of over putting into contracts what ends up there from the operational side.
And I don't disagree with that, but I don't want to take another 5 years to get to there.
Right.
If today, Little Canada wants to say, here are our values, which is different from a White Bear, okay?
Yeah.
Because, and I totally agree with you, but another 5 years, John stated in the beginning, this conversation on this board started back in '08. It is now 2023.
Mr. Chair, we're working right now on some of the conversations around broader risk issues with the contract cities, and we being we're involved in it, finance is involved, Scott's involved. We're going to continue this conversation directly with them. This is not a 5-year thing. And there's just one other dynamic I'll add here, which is I appreciate people's respect around the table and wanting to respect each other's thing. But when the data says certain things, people need to realize the data says certain things. And I reject the notion that all sides are equally right on this issue. The county attorney's work has proven with some of these cities that have been willing to come along that you can make your community safer and more equitable through the implementation of a policy that stops pretextual stops, period. The data shows that. We should have conversations of how to implement. But from my perspective, and I appreciate we all have different spots, my job is to say the data tells us one thing. We have a value that you're getting at here as a board. We need to implement this. So let's talk about how, not if. And there are a few other areas where this continues to come up. And I think it's just important as the state struggles with the challenges, and we have been a part of some of the most upending issues that happen when things go tragically wrong. It's upending for everyone on all sides of every single issue in the end. But whether we're talking about high-speed chases, we're talking about no-knock warrants, we're talking about pretextual traffic stops, or we're talking about fines and fees, these are issues we've leaned into. And I think that at the state level and across this community, we just have to keep leaning in directly with our cities, as well as with the sheriff's office, and hope that we see sooner rather than later. And this fall, as we have budget conversations, it's a good time to continue those dialogues here.
Well, I suggest that we come on an annual basis, we monitor that. Because
Yeah.
if 3 years from now, we're still not there, then we definitely have to see what other methods we take on a more quick term here. Mary Jo?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for indulging me again. I totally agree with everything that you've said, County Manager. And I just want to say, as we all know, that, elections have consequences, and our police chiefs are at the pleasure of their boards, of their city councils. And it's a reflection on the city councils that actually have their police chiefs doing the work that they're doing. And so I gave kudos to our police chief, Erica Scheider, and I want to give kudos to my Roseville City Council for really promoting that. And I think it is about elections that have consequences. So anyone watching this, if you want your city to pay attention to data and really have the actions of your police officers reflect the values of your community, you got to see, those consequences of who you elect to your city council
But
matter.
those city councils reflect that in a contract.
Exactly. Thank you. Yes, for sure.
And I just want to also congratulate the city of Maplewood and taking the leadership. And they've taken leadership in a lot of areas
Yeah.
with embedded social workers and
Yeah.
different things trying to,
They have.
and mental health care.
Yeah.
And so I also want to give kudos to the city of Maplewood.
Rena?
So first, I just want to say thank you, John Troy, for your leadership, for putting this idea forward, right? And taking a risk and taking the idea to action, to a practice, and working with, shout out to the St. Paul and Minnesota Foundation and the Justice Innovation Lab, the George Washington University, Ramsey County Emergency Communications, Lights On and Diversion Solutions to become a partner in this vision that you had, and to step out by yourself to say, this is a value, and that you didn't always have this value, but when you know more and you learn more, you do differently, right? You try to do differently. So I just want to say thank you for your leadership. And when others don't have that value, you are saying clearly, I'm not going to prosecute. You can take your time to stop, but when it comes to my office, we're not going to prosecute it. So you have to decide where your values lie in your work. And so thank you for that. It's not easy standing out and taking a chance and risk and things like that. Not everyone does that. I would be remiss to not share a little bit information about how I see it historically within the Black community. As a legislator, when we declared racism a public health crisis and created the Select Committee on Racial Justice, we had to do our homework because some of this stuff you just don't learn in school and you just don't know. And so part of that homework that I was able to do along with Representative Ruth Richardson was to dig deep into policing in America and to look at where we are and recognizing, where the policing come from. It came out of the slave patrol, right? We just celebrated Juneteenth and all that meant, but we also, out of that came Jim Crow laws, which was like rounding people up and bringing them back into servitude, into slavery. And so the slave patrol is where it started to where we are now in policing in America. And what you have, when you talk about a narrative around policing in the Black community, is that these narratives that has been created over hundreds of years that talk about black people being dangerous, that black people cannot be trusted, that black people look suspicious, that we're going to stop them because they must be selling drugs or they must have a gun, that something detrimental to our society is happening. And so there's a target, an intentional target, and you know, we're talking about driving now, but in so many other spaces where there have been intentional targeting of blacks in America, whether they are black men, black women, or black children. It has happened. And so, you know, there is this concept about, you know, how do we spend our time? And we need a data and a research to create a different narrative about what we are doing and why we are doing what we're doing. You know, and it definitely can be dangerous for law enforcement, right, to make these stops, and you do it at nighttime, you do it in the dark, you do it in places where there's not enough lighting. Absolutely can be very dangerous for law enforcement. But I tell you, it has often been very dangerous for black people who often find themselves dead or incarcerated and things like that. And so that's why we see that discrepancy in who is being stopped, is because of this long history in America of how they have utilized and pictured black people as being dangerous, can't be trusted, look suspicious, must be doing something wrong, must be. You know, but I have to tell you what happens is not just the dangerous situation for law enforcement, but it's also what happens to a black person when you are continuously the target, and the trauma that we endure, the distrust of law enforcement because we are continuously being targeted, the disproportionate losing of a job, a license, and things like that that happen because of that encounter, being in poverty and staying in poverty, you know, so, you know, we laws that, you know, or practices that happen because, you know, people studies the habits of black people, and then they create laws that disproportionately impact them. So when you see someone dangling something from the rear mirror, that's something that we do, and then it has become, you know, a law that says you can't do it. And a law that you're like, who is that hurting? You think we will actually put something in our rearview mirror that will obstruct us, our visual from happening? What really does that do? And why was that law made, that law? You know, and so these habits that has happened, it caused disproportionately what we saw happen to Philando Castile. A consistent stopping for nonviolent or, you know, just
Brake
whatever, right?
Brake light.
It happens. We saw what happened to George Floyd, right? That was like an eye-opening for so many other people who did not know that black people don't have to do anything wrong to get killed by police. And this is nothing against police officers, because, you know, I had a son who wanted to be a police officer. At the age of 10, decided that he wanted to be a police officer. And I said, "Are you sure?" He said, "Yeah." So every Saturday morning, I would get up and make him, he was a police cadet. And I would take him down, you know, every Saturday morning, you know, and got him a police officer to mentor him. You know, very intentional, because I think it's important that we want to be a part of, you know, patrolling our community, saving lives, doing the work of police officers. And we have to encourage that in our black community. But there's a lot of distrust there. And my son, you know, stayed in there to about 14 years old of wanting to be a police officer. And then one day he came to me and said, "You know what, I don't want to be a police officer." And I was like, "Why? I've been getting up every Saturday for all these years, taking you down." you know, but it's the perception of how police officers are seen in our community. I know a young lady who is a sheriff, who, you know, is driving a vehicle in full uniform and said to me about a couple of months ago, I was driving in my patrol car, full uniform, and a police car drove up beside me. And she said, I got nervous. I was like, wait a minute. You are in full gear in a squad car. But she still was nervous. Because that history, those histories are passed down from generation to generation. That fear and that trauma and that engagement in the black community is handed down for generation to generation. But so is racism. So is policies and practices. And that everyday people that don't look like me, it has been handed down to them about what to expect of black people. I can still walk in certain places and walk behind certain people who will stop so I can go in front of them. So it doesn't matter that you have a master's degree or you're a county commissioner or you're this and that and the other. Those type of thoughts and actions and practices are handed down to today. To today. It's not of yesterday or way back then. And so I just had to share that and bring that insight to this space here so that I can bring a different perspective, because sometimes things are not logical. Sometimes things are just not logical. It is just how people show up. It's what has been passed down from generation to generation. It is. It is. And so I just want to, you know, not only thank our county attorney, John Troy, for his leadership and being brave, but this board for being open, being brave, being transformational, open to learning and listening, and say we're going to do better, right? Because we have that power to do better, and not let the old habits and thoughts passed down. Because I'm checking myself right now. I'm going to have to tell you guys, I'm checking myself about how I'm showing up in spaces and how I'm speaking to people, because I know the history. And we can't just put things on papers and put things and say it's there, because there's a history. And sometimes I get a little bit strong, because when we set the deck and put policies and practice in place and say I'm going to bring in community to now be a part of a discussion, but you already set the perimeters. And now they have to work within those perimeters that you set instead of really listening to the community about what that needs to look like. I get a little something here, right? That pushes back at people and say, check yourself. Just check yourself and have you've already set the table and already set the deck. And we are keenly aware of that. Not just me. We are keenly aware of the tables that have been set in front of us to now work within those perimeters of what has been set for us to participate in the process. And so this is so much more than your presentation, I know. But I do just want to say that, because it's not just about public safety. It's in all areas, every last area, that we work so hard to create more fair and just systems and practice and protocols and build relationships. And so that's my piece. I had to let you guys know where I'm standing and as a black woman in dealing with trying to be more fair and equitable in a county that I do see transformational work happening, and I do see it within. But that doesn't mean that we are all the way there yet. We still have some work to do.
Well, Commissioner, let me reinforce that I usually don't speak about my experiences, but 25 years ago, my youngest brother is a retired police officer. 25 years ago, we're in his private automobile. I'm sitting in the passenger seat, and he says, "We're going to drive down this street, this neighborhood. I guarantee you we'll be stopped." We were stopped. The police officer came out. He let the police officer go through whatever, I forget now, it's 25 years ago, all through his rap, as I say it. And then he asked my brother and me to get out of the car. At that point, my brother flashes his badge. All of a sudden, it was a whole different story. So those things still happen today, not just 25 years ago. So I just want to reinforce your very instructive story there. Any other questions, discussion? Well, thank you. Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, because I'm asking a lot. Thank you so much, Commissioner Moran, for sharing that. It's always so good for us to hear and be reminded. Thank you so much. So where do we go from here? I mean, we're just going to be continuing to collect data and hope that this will just become, I mean, this is the way it is. So we'll just keep collecting data and hoping that the numbers
Yeah,
will
I mean,
lead us where they
I
do.
think there's still more work to be done.
Okay.
I mean, the fund needs more resources from the philanthropy community, and so I'll be working to try to raise some more resources there so that we can fund out the alternative for a period of time. We haven't had a direct conversation about this, but we've got to figure out a way to, get the data so that it's just more regularly collected. And I think on a regular basis, we should share that out. I mean, we know how to do this research now, and we have resources, I think, within the county to try to pull some of these numbers and just show them on a dashboard or on just some way so that the public can follow this, because I think without that transparency, we'll never know. It'll just go into a black hole, right? So this is like, for me, it's kind of like life work, so I'm not going to let it go. And then again, there's things that I think we could have some conversations about just from a legislative platform about the things that Ramsey County has done that could be modeled at the state level to reduce some of those fines and fees and some of the things that we just talked about on these equipment violations, that maybe we should get the state to take some action. Because I think that's, quite frankly, where the resources and some of the ability to make it less like controversial or cultural. I just feel like there's such divisions when you start talking about some of these issues, and if we could somehow figure out a way to maybe get something passed next year, I think that'd be great. And so I think those are some next steps that need to happen, and just continued conversations with our police leaders. I think right now, at this moment in time, we've got a number of good police leaders in our county who want to do racial equity work. Kudos again to Chief Erica Scheider, but her policy actually connects her work to the city council's racial equity goals, right? And I really believe that in the power and the depth of what Commissioner Moran just said, I hope that all of our police leaders are listening, because at the end of the day, if we truly want to lean into a more just and equitable society in a community, then what we need to be doing is recognizing that that the systems need to change, so that we're listening to the perspectives of what Commissioner Moran just said. Oftentimes, the way that our society is set up is that people need to adapt to systems. And what Commissioner Moran just talked about, what many of you have been talking about, what Commissioner Tony Carter, former commissioner, had been talking about our work in terms of this transformation, is about empowering people that have never been invited to the table, to bring them, give them a voice, and to actually make those changes. This county, we're deeply invested and involved and engaged in doing that type of work. That's a value that when every county employee turns on their computer, they see the wheel that Ramsey County has, and one of those values is about sharing power. It's about connecting in a meaningful way with our community. But sadly, and as Commissioner Moran had talked about, that the way that society in general is configured is that people have to adapt to the way things are. And if things are not right for a certain community, then the systems, the people that have the power, need to make those changes and to adapt, and that's the journey that we are all on together.
Mr. Chair, tight wrap up on it would be to just hit a couple points. We should make sure we have data story in the data story section of the open data portal. This is a good one. We'll continue to work on that. An annual follow-up here on this point to the chair's earlier question. That's a good way to keep all of us accountable to one another and continue to see the data as we go forward. So that's another commitment piece there. Is it's a great committee of the whole or something to be doing as we're planning out the next year. And that's a good way to get the data out. I definitely, on the legislative front, totally agree. In a policy year, how do we think about the policy side? And I'll end on, I appreciate the reference to the values and the wheel that shows up. And I would just say, one of the things this board does a good job of pushing on is, if you truly believe all means all, and all are valued and thrive, you simply can't have some of the stories we continue to hear. And that doesn't mean that everybody here is good or bad or anywhere else. What it means is it's our job to change it so those stories don't exist. And that's the optimism that we'll leave here today and continue forward.
Victoria?
Well, and that was actually, thanks for the wrap up there, and thank you, Commissioner Moran, to be able to verbalize that so that people can try to understand, because you live it. I don't. And I want to, that's important for me to hear and for other people to hear. And that's why I've been so committed to the transformational work that we're doing here, because it's just the equity issue, and talking to people about that is sometimes they just don't get it because they're so set in their ways or whatever. Well, we need to change those ways, period. But I don't want this just to be a story that hit the newspaper once. And I hope that not only in our open data portal that we have this information, but that we keep it front and center on our website, that people don't have to search for it, that we've got something that's up there. And I mean, you're getting this data all the time. I mean, it's not just annual that you get it, but now that you've got the base, to somehow highlight that on our website, or if there's some way that we can keep the momentum going from a public perspective, because it was kind of, it's huge. And this meeting that we're having today is huge as far as getting the information out there, but it's still limited. And so I just try to figure out a way that we can keep the spotlight on this, because I think this next year in the legislative session, we need to be able to really show people that it just makes sense. We just need to do this.
Well, thank you, everybody. Great discussion, and we're adjourned. Good work.